From law enforcers to lawbreakers, these FBI agents crossed over to the dark side in the line of duty. They abused their authority, sold out their country, slept with the enemy, and killed to bury their secrets. Their actions, too surreal to be true at times, may sound like a well-scripted movie. And yes, it has inspired many books and movies, but this is no fairy tale. This is what happened to the corrupt FBI agents who were caught and sent to jail. Robert Hansen.
The man involved in one of the most famous spy cases in American history has died.
Walking down the road, Hansen looks like any regular pedestrian. There is nothing about him that would make you think that he was the biggest mole in the United States intelligence community said to have sold out his country for cash and diamonds. Hansen, whose nickname was Dr. Death, was trained in counterintelligence, the designation for officers who are equipped to detect and counter spy operations. Unfortunately, this also made him one of the most equipped spies when he flipped sides to work for the Russians. After years of going undetected, Hansen was eventually arrested on February 18, 2021. But the trained spy knew the FBI was on his trail, and his arrest didn't come as a surprise. Indeed, his only surprise was that the FBI agents hadn't acted sooner. This is why he must have made the infamous statement, "What took you so long?" Maybe he knew his time was up, or he was just tired of bearing the burden of his actions. The daily struggle of keeping a secret identity while also stealing sensitive information and carrying out dead drops would make for an interesting spy thriller, no doubt about that. But it is also a heavy burden to carry if you ask me. Hansen pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage and was given 15 consecutive life sentences. When he received his sentence, Hansen apologized for his behavior and also for the irreversible damage he had done to his family, saying, "I apologize for my behavior. I am shamed by it. I have opened the door for calumny against my totally innocent wife and children. I have hurt so many deeply." He may sound remorseful of his actions, but Hansen knew what he signed up for when he approached the Russians to offer them his services. Not for any ideological or political reasons. His motive was mainly financial. It all started in 1985 after he was assigned a foreign counterintelligence division of the FBI New York field office. Hansen sent a letter to the Russians, then the USSR, stating his intention to become a spy. He requested the sum of $100,000, and in exchange, he revealed the names of 3 KGB agents who were spying for the US. The agents, Boris Yuzhin, Valery Martinov, and Sergei Motorin, had already been compromised by a CIA agent turned Russian spy, Aldrich Ames. But Hansen's information must have been a confirmation to the KGB, who immediately recalled the agents to Moscow and tried them. Motorin and Martinov were executed while Yuzhin was imprisoned. The US had lost valuable intelligent assets, but for Hansen, this was a win. He had proven beyond doubt that he could be useful to his new masters. Since he was working in the counterintelligence division of the FBI, Hansen would have been tasked with looking for the mole that had leaked the information to the KGB. So he was basically looking for himself. That is just how much coverage his position had given him. Hansen continued to spy for the Russians, leaking thousands of pages of highly classified documents and dozens of storage disks that contained information on the US nuclear war strategies, military technologies, and active espionage cases. At one time, the FBI had constructed a tunnel under the Soviet embassy for counterintelligence purposes, but they never got to use it because the Russians somehow got wind of its existence. There is no telling just how far Hansen was willing to betray his country. Although the FBI long suspected that there was a mole within the agency, they didn't know who it was, and it would have likely remained this way until a bold plan was hatched. To catch the mole, the FBI had to turn to a former KGB agent who provided documents that proved their suspicion all along. After analyzing the documents, the FBI was finally able to link Hansen to the security breaches within the organization. From then on, Hansen became a target of the Bureau. First, he was removed from his position, which gave him access to sensitive documents. In a letter to his handlers, Hansen referred to his new job as a do-nothing job. He was spooked, but he continued to make contact with the Russians right up to the last moment when he was arrested. On that day, Hansen had seen a friend off at the airport before he drove down to a park in Virginia where he was to make a dead drop. The FBI swooped in and arrested Hansen in the act of espionage. This was when Hansen made his infamous comment, "What took you so long?" The FBI agent who worked undercover to infiltrate and expose Hansen said that he was a James Bond fanatic. He wanted to live that James Bond lifestyle. He wanted to be a spy hunter. But Hansen lacked the physical prowess of a field agent, however. He more than made up for it with a very analytical mind, which is why he had been promoted to the counterintelligence division in the first place. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted more. Pride, hubris, and narcissist were some of the words O'Neill used in describing Hansen, whose escapade inspired the movie Breach. John Connelly. bribery, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and murder. These were the charges against FBI agent John Connelly. For the most part, Connelly's greatest crime was knowing James Bulger, the notorious crime boss of the Winter Hill Gang. His first arrest and conviction was in 2002. Connelly was convicted of racketeering and sentenced to 10 years in prison. In 2008, he was given a new sentence of 40 years in prison after he was convicted of playing a role in the death of a key witness who was meant to testify against the crime boss. Connelly had informed Bulger of the plan, and in a typical mobster style, Bulger got rid of the witness. The prosecutors had demanded a life sentence, but the judge handed him a 40-year sentence, which to the 68-year-old man can still be regarded as a life sentence. Aside from his age, some speculate that the dirty nature of his job as a handler might have influenced the judge's decision. However, it wasn't lost to the court that regardless of what the job entailed, Connelly had sold his badge and honor to the very people that he was meant to handle. You left law enforcement. You forfeited that badge that so many people wear proudly. For an FBI agent to go to the dark side is a sad, sad day, the judge said. Connelly, who had already been serving time in prison before the new charges were brought against him, insisted he had nothing to do with the death of the businessman, saying that he never sold his badge or took any money or hurt anyone knowingly. But his pleas fell on deaf ears for many reasons, one of which is that long before Connelly became Bulger's handler, the two were already friends. He even bragged about his friendship with the mob boss, saying, "Whitey only talked to me because he knew me from when I was a kid. He knew I'd never help him, but he knew I'd never hurt him." Their story began many years ago in Boston, New England. Connelly and Bulger, then neighbors, gradually formed a pact of friendship that lasted many years as childhood friends who happened to take different paths in life. Connelly grew up admiring Bulger, who right from his teenage years had already carved a niche for himself in the world of crime. Soon after high school, the two friends found themselves on entirely different paths in life. Connelly pursued a career in the FBI where he made a name for himself after hunting down and arresting famous mob boss Frank Salome. While Connelly was building his career, Bulger was also rising in the criminal world. He formed the Winter Hill Mob in 1972, a year before Connelly was transferred to the Boston field office. Once again, their paths were about to cross. Connelly was a decorated FBI agent, but his fame came at a huge cost to the Bureau. After returning to his hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, Connelly made a pact with his childhood friend, who by then was a mob boss. Contrary to the nature of organized crimes, Bulger, who definitely knew better, agreed to be an informant for the FBI. The FBI must have celebrated the deal, believing that turning a hardcore mob boss like Bulger meant access into the inner circle of mob crime in the Boston area. At the same time, I fail to see why they would believe that Bulger would easily become an FBI informant, knowing that his reputation and life were at stake. In Bulger's world, the punishment for snitching is death, which makes me believe that Bulger must have known that he had more to gain by partnering with Connelly. In a typical handler-informant relationship, information would flow in one direction, that is from the informant to the handler. But in Connelly's pact with Bulger, it was a two-way street. Bulger provided Connelly and the FBI with useful tips that helped lace Connelly's career with accolades. But Bulger had the better deal. Not only was he getting rid of his enemies with the help of the FBI, he was also being protected by the Bureau. Connelly turned a blind eye to crimes committed by Bulger, and although he took the fall for it, the FBI wasn't innocent. By trying to hide their dirty linens, they aided Connelly and Bulger, whose crimes were becoming worse by the day. It is alleged that Connelly was on Bulger's payroll and had received over $200,000 from the mob boss. But it wasn't the payment or lavish parties that landed Connelly in jail for 40 years. It was the tip-offs. As I mentioned, Connelly's relationship with Bulger was a two-way street, and occasionally Connelly would provide Bulger with inside information that helped him evade law enforcement officers for many years and expose informers within his ranks. One of the informers was a businessman named John Callahan. Callahan was going to be interrogated by the FBI about a previous murder that could implicate Bulger, but before the FBI could get Callahan to talk, Bulger had him executed. The businessman was shot multiple times, and his body was found in the trunk of his car a few days later. The tip-off had come from Connelly. Connelly was convicted of second-degree murder and continued to serve his sentence until 2021, when he was released from prison because he was ill, and the doctors predicted he had just 1 year to live. Richard Miller. The word spy conjures an image of someone who is very intelligent, among other things. When I hear spy, I see James Bond. Well, maybe I have seen too many spy thrillers, but honestly, I wouldn't imagine that the first ever FBI agent charged with spying for the Russians would be a complete misfit. Richard Miller was described by his peers in so many words that time wouldn't permit me to name them all. Miller got in bed with the Russians, and though he claimed he was a double agent, he was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 20 years in prison after a very lengthy trial that took over 6 years. The first trial was declared a mistrial after 11 weeks, during which time Miller's accomplices were convicted and sentenced successfully. However, Miller held on to his claim that he was only trying to infiltrate the KGB, a convincing argument considering that he was a counterintelligence agent. His second trial ended the same way, with Miller getting bailed after the 2 consecutive life sentences he was given were overturned on legal grounds. Call it dumb luck if you may, but I totally agree. For some reason, the judge had failed to admit an important evidence during the trial. This one mistake saved Miller a lifetime of imprisonment. But like they say, the third time's the charm. Miller's lucky streak ended in the third trial, but compared to his previous sentence, Miller had dodged a bullet when he was given only 20 years. The FBI desperately needed a win, and 20 years, though not what the prosecutors had expected, was a win nonetheless. However, I won't put all the blame on Miller. Yes, he committed the crime, but his supervisors in the FBI had long seen the signs and chose to ignore them. You can barely find a single positive remark about him, not even from his colleagues. It begs the question, just how bad does one have to be so despised among your people? Long before he flipped sides, Miller was the kind of guy that stood out for all the wrong reasons. First, he was overweight and often had food crumbs and stains on him. This made his superiors sanction him, hoping that it would inspire him to get into shape. If that was his only inadequacy, the situation would have been far from abysmal. Miller stole comic books and candy, which he ate with reckless abandon. He stole from his relatives, skimmed from the money meant to be paid out to an FBI informant, and also used FBI resources for personal gain by running vehicle registration checks and sharing data from FBI criminal indexes with a private investigator for as much as $500. His personal life was a complete mess, and according to former Special Agent Gary Aldrich, anyone who met him would agree that Miller should never have been hired by the FBI. He went on to say, how Miller even got through the FBI Academy was a big mystery, but how Miller avoided losing his job for being one of the dumbest, most unkempt, most unpopular misfits the agency had ever hired was not a mystery. And he was right. The FBI aided Miller by not taking clear and decisive actions early on. According to reports, Miller's job performance was poor, even though he had put in 20 years in the bureau. Eventually, his superiors decided that he needed closer supervision, so Miller was transferred to the counterintelligence division, where his only job was to interview Soviet emigres and to do paperwork. This would later turn out to be the worst decision ever, because it was during this time that Miller crossed paths with an emigre who successfully turned him into a spy. Her name was Svetlana Ogorodnikov. Like every good spy thriller, it all started with romance. Although Miller claimed he had intended to use Svetlana to redeem his image in the bureau by turning her into a double agent or infiltrating the KGB, it seems he was out of his league. Soon after he made contact with Svetlana on a beach in Malibu, their relationship quickly escalated from a social relationship into an intimate one. After Miller and Svetlana made out with each other a couple of times, Svetlana made her move. She confided in Miller that she worked for the Russians and they were willing to pay him for classified documents. This was no news to Miller, and although he would like you to believe it was all part of his plan to win over Svetlana and turn her, I believe for the most part, his greed made him go along with it. It is said that Miller requested $50,000 in gold and $15,000 in cash for his cooperation. As their relationship deepened, so did Miller's cooperation. To prove he was a valuable asset, Miller gave his credentials and the FBI counterintelligence reporting manual to the Russians. Although his superior had known of Miller's relationship with Svetlana, they only started actively tailing him after he made contact with the Russians. When Miller noticed the FBI was on his tail, he made an unexpected move. Miller went straight to his superior to clear the air, saying that he was acting as a double agent. He later confessed to espionage after he was arrested, but soon backpedaled and went back to the story that he had been acting as a double agent. On the other hand, his Russian acquaintance and her husband pleaded guilty and were sentenced to prison, while Miller's case continued to drag on. Gordon Liddy. "I'd do it again for my president." Those were Liddy's words many years after the failed burglary attempt that landed him in prison. Liddy, the head of a not-so-elite team of political operatives, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his role in the Watergate scandal. From the Army to the FBI and then the White House, Liddy had carved a niche for himself when he helped the then President of the United States, Richard Nixon, win his election. Nixon was offered a place in the inner circle, first as a special assistant in the Nixon administration and later as general counsel. In his new role, Liddy's job was to help the president save face by identifying sources of information leaks in the administration. He was also tasked with gathering intelligence on the opposition, as well as stirring up controversies with the aim of discrediting the Democrats. It was during the course of his job that Liddy and his team, who were codenamed the Plumbers, were arrested after a failed attempt to break into the Democratic headquarters in Watergate. This wasn't the first time Liddy had led a team of operatives inside the building. The first incident occurred on May 28, 1972, when Liddy and his team and bugged the headquarters of the Democrats. The operation was a successful one, but less than a month later, the team had to run a second operation in the building. This time, they ran out of luck. It is not clear why the team had to go back into the building barely a month later, partly because Liddy was tight-lipped during the trial, but it was gathered that some bugs that had been planted in the offices needed to be fixed. For the most part, the operation would have been a successful one, if not for a 21-year-old intern, Bruce Givner, who stayed back in the office longer than he was supposed to. By the time Givner was ready to leave the office, it was about midnight. Givner had only gone to get some snacks along with the security guard. Liddy's crew had been patiently waiting all night for an opportunity to sneak into the building. So the moment Givner and the security guard left, the team entered the building. On getting back, the security guard noticed a piece of tape on a door latch while he was making his rounds. He didn't give it much thought at first and simply took off the tape, but he passed by the door later and noticed the tape had been replaced. That was unusual, and so he called the police. Plainclothes officers arrived at the building shortly after and arrested all 5 men who were said to be affiliated with the CIA. It didn't take long before one of the men revealed a disturbing secret. In a few words, Martinez told the FBI agent assigned to the case that they were working for the same man. When pressed further, Martinez went on to tell the FBI agent, "You work for the government, I work with the government, and we're going to be taken care of by the government and by the man, the president." The investigation led to the arrest, trial, and conviction of Gordon Liddy, as well as President Nixon's resignation. Liddy was charged with burglary, conspiracy, and illegal wiretapping. He refused to testify before the Senate committee and during his trial, saying that his father did not raise a rat, and many years later, he did not regret that decision. According to him, it doesn't take any talent to keep your mouth shut. This macho man personality betrays the fact that as a child, Liddy was frail and fearful, especially of rats. To overcome his weakness, Liddy turned to the unorthodox traditions of Native Americans and the Zulu tribes, who were known to eat the heart, brains, and genitals of their enemies. So Liddy emulated them by cooking and eating a rat as a way of facing and overcoming his fears at the age of 11. He was later quoted saying, "From now on, rats could fear me as they feared cats." This was only the beginning of his bizarre behavior. Liddy's way of thinking and solving problems was so otherworldly that President Nixon once said, "He must be a little nuts." The president's words couldn't be any truer. Liddy was indeed out of his mind. He once placed his hand over a cigarette lighter as proof of his promise not to leak the identity of a lady he was trying to recruit. As the general counsel to President Nixon's re-election campaign, Liddy's plan, codenamed Gemstone, involved the use of kidnapping, burglary, surveillance, and prostitutes to gather intelligence on political rivals. He once suggested that war protest organizers should be kidnapped and taken to Mexico. The assassination of investigative journalist Jack Anderson and firebombing the Brookings Institution were all part of his elaborate strategy to preserve the integrity of the Nixon administration. Unfortunately, his plans became his undoing, but even after he was released from prison, Liddy continued agitating for the right wing through his radio talk show. Mark Putnam. As they say, there is a first time for everything, and we have heard first-time cases of corruption and espionage within the FBI. Mark Putnam made it to the list of FBI first-timers for killing his lover. He was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to prison for 16 years. Putnam's case was a peculiar one that started when the young FBI agent came in contact with a woman named Susan Smith. Fresh out of the FBI academy, Putnam found himself in a more or less deserted FBI outpost in Kentucky. Little did he know that his life was about to change because of a crime that had happened a few months earlier. Putnam and his partner got involved in the hunt for the bank robber who had stolen $18,000 in cash, and their investigation led to a suspect who has been in the crosshairs of law enforcement officers as a repeat offender. But with no proof that Cat-Eye Lockhart, as he was called, was the one who stole from the bank, there was nothing law enforcement officers could do. To clamp down on their suspect, Putnam and his partner decided to turn Lockhart's closest allies into informers. The easiest target seemed to be his ex-wife, Susan Smith. Putnam and Susan started meeting frequently during the week, and these clandestine meetings proved fruitful at first, since Susan often divulged useful information regarding what Lockhart was planning next. In exchange for her information, Putnam is said to have paid her thousands of dollars. However, their relationship soon veered off the tracks. Call it infatuation or obsession, but one thing is certain: Susan wanted to be more than just an informant, and Putnam was more than willing to go along with the ride at first. Susan pestered Putnam's home with calls, most of which the wife both recorded. She trimmed her hair to look more like Putnam's wife, Kathy, and even bought the young FBI agent expensive shoes and shirts for Christmas. Reading the handwriting on the wall, Putnam's wife warned her husband of how dangerous Susan was, saying, "Don't you ever get involved with this woman. She will get pregnant and she will ruin you." However, Putnam did the exact opposite. He took Susan on a one-week wild ride in the mountains during which the two of them got intimate. Putnam later confessed he knew his behavior could damage his career and family, which could be why he ended the relationship after the trip. He also decided to put some distance between the two of them by signing a petition that got him transferred to Florida, where he could focus on other cases. This was the best decision, seeing that he had become too involved with Susan. However, it was a decision that was made a little bit too late. The reason is that Susan was already pregnant, and she made it a point to tell everyone who cared to listen that the FBI agent was the father of her unborn child. Kathy's prediction had come to pass. Perhaps it was a lucky guess or a woman's intuition. I really can't tell. But if Putnam listened to his wife, he wouldn't have found himself in the mess he did. Being that Putnam and his family had already relocated to Florida, Susan's stunts could only hurt them so much, and it would have remained so had Putnam not returned to Kentucky to finish up with a case. That was when everything unraveled. Susan met with Putnam and informed him that she was pregnant with his child. On hearing that, Putnam told Susan he would get a paternity test done once the child was born, and also suggested that he and his wife adopt the child. Putnam claimed that Susan became very angry at his words, and another account of the incident mentioned that Susan threatened to tell Kathy and Putnam's superiors at the FBI that she was pregnant with his child. This led to a fight which eventually ended with him strangling Susan to death. Seeing that he had killed his lover, Putnam decided to hide the body. He placed the limped body in the trunk of his car and dumped it by the roadside before returning to Florida. Racked with guilt, Putnam turned himself in and revealed to investigators where he had disposed of Susan's body. By this time, it had already been a year since he murdered Susan. According to the prosecutor, Putnam's lawyer had called to say, "I have a man who wants to confess to murder or homicide and wants to go to the penitentiary." Although his decision to confess to the murder has been attributed to guilt, it was also speculated that the move was intended to hide something more damaging. However, there is nothing that proves this suspicion. At the time, medical examiners couldn't find any indication that Susan was pregnant. Indeed, nobody is above the law, not even the members of law enforcement agencies. If you like this video, click the card on your screen to see more videos like this.